Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let us return to our main character. The chandelier lights shimmered above the long white tablecloth, throwing diamonds of reflection across untouched wine glasses. The evening was meant to celebrate success, Evan's promotion, his growing reputation, and the arrival of his high-profile clients. At the far end of the banquet hall, Thomas Reed sat quietly, hands folded, his old suit pressed as best he could. The tie around his neck, slightly faded at the edges, was the same one his late wife had chosen for their anniversary dinner years ago. It was all he had worn to events that demanded dignity. Evan raised his glass and smiled broadly at the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice full of effortless charm. "This is my father, Thomas Reed. He retired early and spends his days polishing old medals and watching documentaries about people who actually made history." A ripple of laughter traveled through the room. "He's a good man, but he's, kind of old-fashioned. A bit of a loser when it comes to ambition." The laughter deepened. Forks tapped against plates, someone even whistled. Thomas didn't move. He simply smiled, his eyes soft behind the rim of his glass. A man 2 tables away turned toward him with a look of curiosity. Colonel Harris, Evans' supervisor, had been half listening to the speech until that moment. His face shifted as if a memory had brushed across it. Thomas took a slow sip of water. The room smelled faintly of perfume and roast lamb, the noise swelling into a polite roar. He heard Evan's voice again, confident, proud, unaware. Every word felt like a pebble dropped into a deep well where patience lived. Thomas remembered Helen's voice, the way she used to laugh whenever someone underestimated him. "Let them," she'd say. "Truth has better timing than pride." The band started playing softly in the background, a string quartet that didn't belong to this level of vanity. Thomas's gaze drifted to the photograph on the far wall, a black and white picture of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The caption beneath read, "12th Airborne Division, Operation Grey Eagle, 1999. His reflection overlapped with the faces in the photo. No one else noticed. Across the table, one of Evan's colleagues leaned forward. "So, Mr. Reed," he said casually, "what line of work were you in before retirement?" Thomas smiled politely. "Once I worked in logistics." The man chuckled. "Oh, supply chain, huh? My uncle did that in the Army. You must have seen some interesting spreadsheets." Thomas nodded. "Something like that." His voice held no resentment, no defensiveness. Just calm, the kind that comes from years of learning, when silence says more than a speech. From the corner of his eye, he saw Colonel Harris scrolling through his phone. The colonel stopped, frowned, zoomed in on a photograph, and then looked up again. His expression shifted from casual curiosity to disbelief. At the next table, a group of veterans chatted over drinks. One of them, a heavy-set man with a gray mustache, paused mid-sentence. "Hold on," he murmured to his friend. "That man over there, doesn't he look like General Reed? The one who went missing after Grey Eagle?" His friend laughed softly. "Come on. General Reed's supposed to be dead. Or living on some island. You think that guy in a thrift store suit is him?" The mustached man squinted. "Maybe not. But I'd bet my pension I've seen that face before." Meanwhile, Evan clinked his glass again, riding the wave of attention. "You know," he continued, "Dad used to tell these wild stories about discipline and honor stuff from another century. Guess he never learned that sometimes you have to bend the rules to get ahead." More laughter. Thomas placed his glass down carefully. The water inside barely trembled. He looked at his son, not with anger, not with sadness. but with a calm that had once steadied men in chaos. He adjusted his tie. The scent of cedar lingered faintly on the fabric, the scent of the drawer where he'd kept it sealed for years. The band switched to a slower tune. Conversation softened. Colonel Harris rose from his chair and approached the table. His face had gone pale. He stopped behind Evan, eyes locked on Thomas. Sir Harris said quietly, voice trembling, "Forgive me, but your name?" "You said Thomas Reed." Thomas nodded. The colonel's hand trembled as he reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone again, turning the screen around. On it was an old photograph, a group of soldiers standing beside a helicopter in the desert dust swirling around their boots. In the center stood a younger version of Thomas, his uniform crisp, his insignia unmistakable. "I served under you," Harris whispered. "Operation Grey Eagle. You saved 50 men that night." Evan frowned. "Wait, what? That's impossible. My father's never even—" Harris ignored him. He straightened heels, clicking together, shoulders squared. The entire hall seemed to lean toward them, drawn by a silence that carried more weight than all the laughter before it. General Reed Harris said, voice ringing with respect, "It's an honor to finally meet you again." He saluted. The sound of crystal breaking echoed as Evan's glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the marble floor. The chatter stopped. The string quartet froze mid-note. Someone gasped. Thomas blinked slowly, still seated. "At ease, Colonel," he said softly. "That was a long time ago." But Harris didn't move. "Sir," he said louder now, "it's because of you I'm standing here. You ordered us to hold the line when command wanted to retreat. You walked into fire. You carried the wounded out yourself." Thomas's jaw tightened slightly, but his eyes remained kind. "We all did what we had to." Evan looked between them, color draining from his face. "Dad, Thomas stood, then slow and steady. The years fell away from his shoulders as he rose. The calm in his voice carried the echo of command, quiet but absolute. "I'm just a man who served his country," he said. "Nothing more." The colonel lowered his salute but didn't look away. The room held its breath. Every person in that glittering hall who had laughed minutes ago now watched in silence. Someone whispered, "General Reed." "The one who disappeared?" Another voice answered. "They said he refused the medal, said he walked away after the war." Thomas adjusted his jacket, gave a faint nod toward the colonel, and turned toward the door. He moved through the stunned crowd with the same composure that had once guided men through smoke and gunfire. The marble floor reflected him as if it wanted to memorize his steps. Behind him, the murmurs grew. Words like hero legend and general collided with a lingering taste of embarrassment. Evan stood motionless, the remnants of wine crawling toward his polished shoes. His co-workers looked anywhere but at him. As Thomas reached the exit, he paused. The night air from the open door touched his face, cool and quiet. He didn't look back. Behind him, Colonel Harris spoke again, this time softly, almost to himself. "You said once that victory is measured by silence, sir. Guess you were right." Thomas stepped into the corridor. The muffled music resumed behind him, uncertain and off-tempo. He walked down the hallway past the mirrors that reflected only fragments of him, the shoulders of a soldier, the patience of a father, the dignity of a man who had nothing left to prove. Outside, the city lights blinked against the dark like distant campfires. He breathed deeply, straightened his tie, and allowed himself the smallest smile. Inside, the room buzzed with questions. Outside, the night waited still and understanding, the kind of quiet only a soldier knows before the next battle. The air inside the Denver Veterans Club smelled of oak-polished cigar smoke and old medals. I hadn't been there in over 20 years. The last time I'd stepped into that hall, I was a younger man standing in uniform beside brothers I thought I'd never outlive. Tonight, my son's voice echoed off those same walls, filled with the arrogance of a generation that mistook ease for victory. "Dad, this is the place," Evan said, leading the way through a crowd of suits and decorated guests. "These are the guys I told you about, executives from Langford Industries. They sponsor veteran charities now. It's a great opportunity for you to meet them." I nodded, letting him walk a step ahead. His confidence was the kind that comes before understanding. He'd invited me to this company dinner to network, not knowing that most of the men here already knew my name, though they'd learned to pretend otherwise. Langford stood near the bar, raising his glass high, his voice booming. "Evan, glad you could make it. And this must be your father." He turned to me, extending a hand that wore a gold watch worth more than my car. "Thomas Reed, right?" "The retired sergeant." I took his hand lightly. "Something like that." Evan grinned, oblivious to the tension humming between us. "Dad served in the military for 25 years, he said proudly. "Now he mostly just reads and gardens, keeps things simple." Langford's smile thinned. "Simple is good. We can't all live in boardrooms, can we?" A few men laughed softly. Evan chuckled along, not realizing the jab was sharper than it sounded. I didn't move. I'd learned long ago that silence can weigh more than words. Langford shifted first, breaking eye contact. I watched his composure flicker just for a second as recognition passed behind his eyes. "Thomas Reed," he repeated, as if testing the taste of the name. "You were stationed under General Whitaker, weren't you? Gray Eagle Division?" The room's noise dimmed just slightly. I could feel the shift in the air. Someone nearby mentioned another round of drinks to fill the pause. "Once upon a time," I said. Langford's jaw tightened. "Small world. I did some contracting for that division years ago. Supply chain, long time back." Harris's voice broke through the crowd. "Long enough to forget a few things, huh?" "Langford?" He was older now, walking with a cane, but his presence still carried command. His gray eyes met mine and softened just barely. "Thomas," he said quietly, "I didn't think I'd see you here." "Neither did I answered. Evan looked between us. "You two know each other?" Harris smiled at him. "Your father and I shared a few years neither of us can quite shake off." Langford laughed a little too loudly. "Well, small circles, small world. Let's drink to good memories, shall we?" He gestured toward a group of investors waiting near the piano. "Evan, bring your father along. I'd like to introduce him." As we crossed the room, Harris leaned close. "He's playing a dangerous game, Tom. The kind that starts with smiles and ends with smoke." "Let him play," I said quietly. Everyone reveals themselves in the light. The dining hall glowed with gold chandeliers and champagne reflections. Waiters carried trays of hors d'oeuvres. Hors d'oeuvres passed tables lined with executives and officers who'd traded their uniforms for tailored suits. I sat beside Evan, who was already deep in conversation about contracts and innovation. He spoke the language of ambition fluently. It reminded me of myself before the noise of the world got too loud to bear. Langford tapped his glass for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "before we begin tonight's program, I'd like to honor a few guests, men who remind us why we do what we do." A spotlight swept the room, stopping briefly on Harris, then on me. The applause was polite hollow in its rhythm. Langford continued, "Thomas Reed served this country with distinction. His generation built the foundation for everything we enjoy today." Evan smiled proudly, turning to me. I simply raised my glass in acknowledgement. Langford paused, glancing at me again with a smirk he couldn't quite hide. "You know I remember stories from that division. Gray Eagle, wasn't it? Some said it was cursed. Equipment failures, communication breakdowns, political cover-ups. Must have been hell out there." His words landed like ash. Harris stiffened, his knuckles white around his cane. Evan frowned, confused by the tone. "Dad doesn't talk about it much," he said lightly. "He's a private guy." Langford nodded. "Of course. Sometimes the past is better left quiet." The laughter that followed was small, nervous, but it was enough. Evan laughed too, maybe out of habit. I looked at my son and felt something inside me twist, not anger, not shame, but the quiet ache of knowing the distance between understanding and ignorance. Harris spoke first. "Funny thing about curses," he said, his voice calm but cutting. "They tend to follow the people who make them." Langford's face twitched, then smoothed over. The Colonel still has his bite. The band started playing again, a soft jazz tune that filled the spaces between tension. The moment dissolved, or pretended to, but Langford wasn't done. He leaned closer, his breath thick with bourbon. "Tell me, Reed," he murmured, "did you ever regret not taking the medal? I hear the Army offered one. Quite the mystery why you turned it down." Evan looked at me, startled. "What medal?" I set my glass down. "The kind that doesn't fit the man they give it to." Langford chuckled. "Still the same philosopher, I see. You could have been rich, you know. Endorsements, interviews, maybe even a book deal." "Maybe I could have," I said. "But then I'd have had to spend the rest of my life explaining why other men died, and I didn't." The words silenced the table. Even the band seemed to miss a note. Langford stared, uncertain whether to respond. Harris gave a small nod, pride flickering behind his steady eyes. Evan broke the stillness. "Dad, I didn't know." "You weren't supposed to," I said softly. The rest of dinner unfolded like a slow tide pulling back from shore. Conversation shifted to safer topics: markets, politics, charity. Evan excused himself to make a phone call, leaving me alone at the table. Langford drifted away, laughing too loudly again, trying to recover his dominance. Harris returned, sitting beside me. "You handled that better than I would have," he said. "Age helps," I replied. "So does regret." He nodded. "He still owes you, you know. That night in the desert. Half his career was built on your silence. I didn't stay silent for him. I know. But you should have let the truth breathe sooner." "Truth doesn't expire," I said. "It just waits for the right moment to speak." We sat quietly for a while, listening to the muted hum of voices and glasses. Somewhere across the room, Evan laughed at something someone said. The sound was bright, young, untouched by the weight of what he'd just witnessed. Harris sighed. "He's a good man, your boy. But he walks fast. The world's teaching him to confuse movement with progress." "I used to walk that way too," I said, until the noise got too loud to hear what mattered. The Colonel smiled faintly. "He'll learn, one way or another." As the night waned, Langford took the stage again, boasting about his company's new Veterans Initiative, a charity program that sounded generous until you listened to the fine print. He mentioned partnerships, tax benefits, public trust, words polished like bullets. When he finished, he invited a few guests for closing remarks. Harris declined. I was about to do the same when Evan raised his hand. "My father will say something," he announced. Langford's smile froze. "Of course. The floor is yours, General." The title hung in the air like a secret half-remembered. Evan's eyes widened. He'd never heard anyone call me that before. I walked to the microphone slowly, the sound of my shoes echoing against marble floors. "I'm not here to speak about the past I began. Not the medals, not the missions, not the mistakes. I came here because my son invited me to see the world he believes in, the world you're building." I looked around the room. "If this is the world you want, make sure it remembers the cost of the one that came before." Silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was attentive. The kind of silence that listens. I stepped back from the mic. Harris nodded once, satisfied. Langford clapped too loudly, trying to reclaim control. Beautifully said, General. The cost of progress, truly inspiring. Evan watched me, realization dawning in his eyes. General, he whispered as I sat down, you never told me. Wasn't relevant, I said. His mouth open-closed again. He stared at me as if trying to fit a new truth into an old memory. All this time, I said quietly, I was just your father. For the first time that evening, he didn't know what to say. The applause started again, soft but real this time, not for the speech, but for the silence that followed it. When the night ended, I stood near the door while Evan spoke with his colleagues. Harris joined me, leaning on his cane. You didn't humiliate him, he said. You let him do that himself. I smiled faintly. That's always more efficient. Outside, the cold air met my face. The city lights shimmered like memories that refused to die. I heard footsteps behind me, Evan catching up. Dad, he said, breathless. Why didn't you ever tell me who you were? I looked at him, the same question I'd once asked myself decades ago after burying too many good men. Because titles fade, I said. What you do after them is what stays. He nodded slowly. The silence between us wasn't awkward anymore. It was full, heavy with understanding. Let's go home, I said. We walked to the car without speaking. Above us, the night was vast and unjudging, and for the first time in years, I felt no need to fill it with sound. The morning light spilled through my kitchen window, turning the old kettle's steam into a thin silver ribbon. The paper on the counter carried my face on the front page, though the photograph wasn't new. Someone at the event had taken a shot while I was standing near the stage, still silent, one hand resting on the table as Langford spoke. The headline read, Who is General Thomas Reed? I folded it before the words could finish their climb. Titles once printed had a way of staining whatever they touched. I poured coffee, black and calm, and let the sound fill the quiet. Outside, a single crow perched on the fence. He didn't care what name the paper used. He only cared about the crumbs I sometimes left behind. A knock came at the door, sharp, impatient. Harris didn't wait for an invitation. He never did. He stepped inside with a folder under his arm and the same grimness he used to carry into briefings. You've stirred up a hornet's nest, he said. Langford's been calling everyone from the defense committee to old donors. He's claiming last night was a misunderstanding. I'm sure he is, I said, setting 2 cups on the table. Coffee? He sat down, his cane leaning against the chair. He's scared and desperate. But that's when men like him get creative. He'll spin the stories, say you came uninvited, accuse you of trying to ruin his event. I didn't ruin anything, I said. I just reminded the room who paid the original bill. Harris studied me for a long moment. Evan looked proud of you last night. I nodded once. That's new for him. Pride used to run in the other direction. He chuckled softly. He's learning. He tapped the folder. You might want to read this. Graytech Langford's rebranded firm has a defense bid pending approval next month. Billions in play. If your name becomes a symbol of opposition, the board will eat him alive. Then maybe the system still works, I said. Maybe. Or maybe you'll become collateral again. The coffee went quiet between us. I'd learned long ago that every truth carried a cost, but sometimes it took years for the invoice to arrive. Harris reached into his coat and slid a photograph across the table. Do you remember this? It was a younger me standing beside a man with soot on his face, our arms around each other. Behind us, the gray eagle insignia hung on a shredded flag. I ran my thumb across the image. Michael, I said quietly. Harris nodded. My brother. You carried him out that night. I looked up. He deserved better than the story they wrote for him. Harris's eyes glistened, but didn't break. You're still carrying it, aren't you? It never leaves. You just learn to walk with it. He stood adjusting his coat. Langford has no idea how close he's standing to the truth. When he realizes, he'll either run or try to buy it. Watch your step. Thank you, Colonel, I said. Don't thank me. Just don't let him win again. When the door closed behind him, I stayed at the table for a long time. The house hummed with that kind of silence that holds too many voices at once. I reached for the pocket watch Helen had given me years ago. It ticked slow, patient, like a man who'd outlived noise. The phone rang. I let it go twice before answering. Dad Evan's voice came through hesitant. Yes, son. I didn't sleep much. Everyone's been talking since last night. Langford's trying to do damage control, but I think you embarrassed him in front of half the board. I didn't say anything untrue. I know. That's what scares them. There was a pause. He hesitated before asking. Were you really a general? I was, I said. But the rank isn't what matters. It's what you do after you hang up the uniform that counts. He exhaled slowly. I wish you'd told me. You weren't ready to hear it. Maybe. But I could have defended you better. I smiled, even though he couldn't see it. You don't defend the truth, Evan. You let it defend itself. He was quiet for a few seconds. Langford wants to meet with me this afternoon. Says we can clear the air. Should I go? Yes, I said. Go. Listen more than you speak. And don't sign anything. I wasn't planning to. Good. Call me after. Will you be okay? I looked at the folded newspaper. Always. After the call, I walked out to the porch. The sky was wide, the air clean. For the first time in years, I felt something shift, the weight of silence turning from burden to balance. By noon, the phone buzzed again. Harris's number. Langford's making his move, he said. He called a press conference at his corporate headquarters. He's about to paint you as a confused veteran twisting old facts for attention. That's his language, I said calmly. Noise over truth. You should be there. No, I said. Let him speak first. Let him show the world who he is. I could hear Harris exhale, part frustration, part admiration. You're playing a long game again. It's the only one worth playing. By evening, the TV networks had picked up the story. Langford stood behind a podium flanked by flags and smiling employees. He spoke about honoring veterans responsibly and not allowing personal confusion to undermine corporate goodwill. He didn't say my name, but he didn't have to. The smear was precise. He called the Gray Eagle disaster a matter of outdated records and myths. When the reporter asked if he'd ever met me before last night, he smiled thinly. Many men claim to have served under my contracts. War changes memory. I turned the TV off. The truth didn't need a microphone. It just needed patience. At dusk, I took a walk down to the small lake near my house. The water was still reflecting a soft amber sky. Ducks drifted by unconcerned with reputations. I picked up a stone and skipped it once, twice, then let the third throw sink. Behind me, a car door shut. Evan's voice followed. You saw it too, I did. He came to stand beside me, hands in his pockets. He's lying. Everyone knows he's lying, but he's still winning. Temporarily. He frowned. You're not angry. I've been angry before. It changes nothing. So what do we do? I looked at him the same way I used to look at young soldiers waiting for orders that would never come easy. You tell the truth when the room's ready to hear it. Not before. He sighed. I hate how calm you are. Calm isn't surrender, son. It's control. He kicked at the dirt. They offered me a promotion today. Said if I help manage the fallout, I'll be running the PR division by next quarter. And what would you have to say for that promotion, that you overreacted, that you misunderstood the company's history? I watched the water darken with the coming night. Then you'll have to decide which version of me you want to believe. He stared at me, jaw tight. You really think silence can beat him? Silence already has, I said. It's why he's shouting. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain. Evan looked down, his voice softer. When I was a kid, I used to think you were invisible because the world forgot you. Now, I think you chose it. I did, I said. The view's clearer when you're not in the spotlight. He nodded slowly, something changing in his eyes. I want to believe that. I really do. You will, I said, when the noise fades. The first drops of rain touched the lake. Evan stayed beside me, neither of us moving. After a while, he said quietly, If they come after you, I won't stay silent. I smiled. Then, I've already done my job. He left soon after headlights vanishing down the dirt road. I stayed until the rain turned steady, soaking through my coat, washing the dust from my shoes. When I returned home, I found a letter slipped under the door. No return address. The handwriting was neat, unfamiliar. Inside a single line, you were right to keep quiet. Some of us are still listening. No signature, but I knew who it was. Someone from that night in the desert, someone who'd survived the silence the same way I had. I placed the letter beside the old watch and sat down. The clock on the wall ticked once, twice, before blending into the rhythm of the rain. The world outside roared with accusation and noise, but in that small room, peace held its ground. I didn't need to prove anything. The truth had its own patience, and I had learned to wait with it. The restaurant was loud enough to make silence seem like a luxury. Laughter ricocheted off the glass walls, silverware chimed against plates, and a faint smell of wine and grilled salmon hung in the air. My son Evan sat across from me. His sleeves rolled up, his smile polished and practiced. Around him were his colleagues, men and women young enough to call ambition a virtue instead of a habit. Dad, he said, leaning closer so I could hear him over the chatter, my boss is coming. Try to relax, okay? He's a good guy, just high profile. I'll do my best, I said, folding my napkin over my lap. He grinned nervously. And please, no stories about the service or the old days. Just enjoy the dinner. Understood, I said, and meant it. I'd learned long ago that sometimes silence does more work than words ever could. A few minutes later, the man himself arrived. Langford. Tall, tanned, the kind of confidence that came from knowing the room would always turn toward him. He wore his success like a tailored suit, smooth controlled, a performance perfected over time. Evan, he boomed, clapping my son on the back before turning to me. And this must be your father. I stood. Thomas Reed, I said, offering my hand. He shook it briefly, eyes flicking over my modest jacket, my old wristwatch, the faint lines age had drawn across my face. I'd seen that look before in boardrooms and barracks, in men who mistook quiet for weakness. It's good to finally meet you, sir, he said, his smile gleaming. Evan speaks so highly of you. Does he? I asked. Of course, Langford said, waving to a waiter. He's one of the brightest young executives I've seen in years. You must be proud. I am, I said simply. Dinner began. Courses arrived and disappeared in the rhythm of conversation, wine, small talk, polite laughter. Langford dominated the table, spinning tales about mergers, contracts, and visionary leadership. People hung on his words, nodding as though his sentences came with applause built in. I listened quietly, eating slowly. Every so often, Evan glanced at me, perhaps worried I'd break the unspoken rules of the evening, say too little, say too much, or say something that didn't fit the image he'd worked so hard to build. When the main course arrived, Langford turned to me. So Mr. Reed Evan tells me you used to serve in the Army Air Force, I corrected. Retired some years ago. He nodded, slicing into his steak. That explains the posture. I always admire military discipline. Must have been quite the adventure. I smiled faintly. Adventure isn't the word I'd use. A ripple of polite laughter moved around the table, the kind people use when they don't know what else to say. Langford leaned back, glass of wine in hand. I imagine it must be hard adjusting to civilian life after something like that. I mean, the world moves fast now. New skills, new tools, new rules. Not easy for men of your generation. I heard Evan inhale sharply beside me. His voice came quick, almost panicked. Dad's been doing fine, sir. He keeps busy volunteering mentoring. Langford waved him off, smiling as though he hadn't noticed the tension. I don't mean any disrespect. Quite the opposite, actually. We all stand on the shoulders of men like you. It's just... times change. He raised his glass. To progress, he said. The table joined in. I lifted my own glass halfway, then lowered it without a word. Evan gave me a look, pleading, embarrassed. I wanted to tell him not to worry, that there are insults too small to chase and truths too large to explain at someone else's dinner table. Langford leaned toward him. You're lucky, you know, having a father like that. Though I imagine it must have been tough growing up in the shadow of someone so traditional. Evan's jaw tightened. We're different people, he said. Of course, Langford replied smoothly. That's what progress is all about. I set my fork down. Progress, I said quietly, isn't about forgetting who taught you how to walk. For a moment, no one spoke. The noise of the restaurant faded into a strange, brittle quiet. Langford chuckled, trying to recover. Well said, General, he said. Didn't know we were getting a philosopher tonight. Just a man who's seen what happens when people confuse noise for wisdom, I replied. His smile faltered. Evan looked at me, half horrified, half proud. Before anyone could add to the awkwardness, a familiar voice came from the next table. General Reed, I turned. A man in a gray suit stood there, hand outstretched. His hair was silver at the temples, his face older but unmistakable. Harris, I said, standing to shake his hand. It's been a long time. Harris laughed warmly. Too long. I saw you across the room and couldn't believe it. The last time we met was well before everything. Langford's expression changed instantly. You two know each other. We served together, Harris said. Your father here, he's the reason I made it back from the valley. Saved more lives than the reports ever mentioned. The table fell silent. Langford blinked his eyes, darting between us. You mean, you were that General Reed? I smiled mildly. Depends which rumors you've heard. Harris chuckled. No rumor. This man commanded the Grey Eagle unit. You've probably seen the mission quoted in leadership manuals. Strategic retreat turned into rescue. Legendary stuff. Langford's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came. Evan stared at me wide-eyed. You never told me that, he said softly. Didn't seem relevant, I replied. Langford swallowed hard, his earlier confidence melting into something uncertain. I didn't realize, he stammered. That's all right, I said. Most people don't until they have to. The waiter returned to refill glasses, unaware of the shift in atmosphere. The laughter at nearby tables resumed, but ours stayed quiet. Harris excused himself after a few minutes, shaking my hand again. Good to see you, Tom. The world's smaller than we think. Too small, I said. But sometimes just right. When he left, I sat back down. Langford couldn't quite meet my eyes. Evan was still staring at me, the kind of look a son gives when he realizes his father's silence had a reason. Dinner ended quickly after that. Langford's toasts lost their charm, his laughter turned brittle. When the check came, he insisted on paying. My treat, he said, avoiding my gaze. It's not every day I dine with a legend. Outside the air was cool and sharp. Evan walked beside me, quiet for a long time. Dad, he finally said, why didn't you ever tell me about the mission? Because medals don't make a man, I said. How you live after does. He nodded slowly. I thought you stayed quiet because you had nothing to say. Now I know it's because you already said it where it mattered. I looked at him, the streetlights catching the edge of his face. That's how you'll know you've grown up, I said. When you stop needing to be seen to matter. He smiled faintly. I think I'm learning. We walked in silence after that, the city humming around us, the sound of a world that still believed it was new. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the weight of the years lift, not as pride, not as regret, but as peace. The war in my son's eyes was over. The morning after the dinner, sunlight leaked through the blinds in narrow golden lines. The quiet of the house was thick, the kind of stillness that comes after something shifts but hasn't yet found its new balance. My phone buzzed 3 times before I picked it up. It was Evan. Dad, he said quickly, I don't know what happened last night, but Langford called first thing this morning. He wants you to come by the office. He said it's important. Did he say why? No. Just that it's urgent. He sounded different. Different how? Like he was trying not to sound afraid, Evan said. I could hear the unease in his voice, the kind that comes when a man realizes the people he respects are more fragile than he thought. Tell him I'll come by after noon, I said. The Langford Industries headquarters rose above the Denver skyline like an altar made of glass and ego. When I arrived, a young assistant in a Navy suit greeted me with the nervous precision of someone who had been briefed but not told why. Mr. Langford is expecting you, she said, leading me past the elevators and through a series of silent corridors lined with photographs of factories' awards and smiling workers shaking hands with men in expensive suits. His office occupied the entire corner of the top floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the city's sunlight, glinting off the steel like a blade. He was standing there when I entered, his back to me, a glass of water untouched on the desk. Thomas, he said without turning, you're not what I expected. Most people say that, I said. He finally faced me. The arrogance from the restaurant was gone, replaced by a kind of wary calculation. You made quite an impression last night. I didn't say much, I replied. Exactly, he said, coming closer. You said almost nothing, and suddenly every man at that table looked at you like you were holding a secret. Even Harris. That's because I said quietly. He studied my face. The Gray Eagle mission, he said at last. It was you. I didn't answer. Silence did the work for me. Langford exhaled slowly, lowering himself into his chair. Do you know what it's like to find out that the man your company once crossed paths with was the same man your board has been trying to court? The irony is almost elegant. I don't deal in irony, I said. Only facts. He nodded, tapping his fingers against the desk. Then let's deal in one. You could ruin me if you wanted to. I don't want to ruin anyone, I said. But I don't forget. He leaned forward. The company's name, Langford Industries, used to be something else. Graytech Defense. We supplied your unit during that mission. The one that went wrong, I assume you know that by now. I knew it before the first man bled out, I said. His jaw tightened. You think I wanted that? You think I didn't lose sleep over it? I think you slept just fine, I said. He rose, pacing the floor. We were young then. My father ran the contracts. I took over after. I spent 20 years trying to fix what he broke. And how's that going, I asked. He stopped walking and turned toward me. That depends on you. I'm not here for deals, I said. Not a deal, he said quickly. A partnership. You and me. You want accountability, I can give you access to every report, every audit, every reform. Help me rebuild this place the right way. You get your justice, I get my redemption. I looked out the window. The city stretched endlessly below us, cars moving like tiny veins of light. You're asking me to help you clean the blood without mentioning who spilled it. I'm asking you to help me make sure it doesn't happen again, he said. You're respected, decorated. The press would follow your lead. Truth doesn't need a spokesman, I said. It just needs someone to stop lying. Langford exhaled, sinking back into his chair. You're not the kind of man who forgives easily, are you? I forgave a long time ago, I said. I just never forgot what came with it. He poured himself water, hands trembling slightly. You're dangerous, Thomas. Not because you shout, but because you don't. That's the kind of danger the world could use more of, I said. He looked at me for a long time, then smiled without warmth. Maybe I underestimated you. Or maybe you're still fighting a war the rest of us moved past. Some wars don't end when the shooting stops, I said. There was a knock on the door. The assistant stepped in. Sir, the board is ready. Langford waved her off. Tell them to wait. He turned back to me. You'll hear from me again. I suspect our paths are far from finished. I never doubted that, I said, and left. Outside, the afternoon light hit the glass towers, scattering reflections across the street. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Evan. Did it go? Okay, I typed back. It's only beginning. That evening, I found Harris sitting in a booth at our usual diner, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He called me this morning, Harris said without looking up. Langford asked if I'd vouch for him to you. What did you say? I told him you don't need anyone to tell you what a man is. You already know. I smiled faintly. He offered me a partnership. Accountability, transparency, redemption, all the right words in the wrong mouth. Harris chuckled. You going to take it? No, I said. But I'll let him think I might. He raised an eyebrow. Setting a trap, setting a stage, I said. Some truths need an audience. He leaned back, satisfied. You always were a patient man. Patience is just another word for aim, I said. That night I drove home under a sky full of stars, sharp enough to cut through memory. When I got there, the porch light was on. Evan was waiting, pacing. What did he want, he asked. To make peace before he's forced to make amends, I said. He frowned. And you didn't tell him about the reports, about what you know? Not yet, I said. Sometimes you wait until the man digs his own hole before you show him the shovel. Evan hesitated. Dad, I think he's dangerous. Maybe, I said. But men like Langford aren't dangerous because of what they do. They're dangerous because of what they think they can hide. He nodded slowly. So what happens now? Now, I said, we let the truth do what it does best. The porch light hummed, casting our shadows long across the steps. The air smelled of sage and cold metal. I looked at my son, seeing for the first time the man he was becoming, the kind who understood that silence wasn't surrender. It was precision. Dad, he said quietly, when you called me your greatest pride. I didn't deserve it. You didn't have to, I said. You just had to learn what it meant. He smiled, the kind of smile that came from somewhere deeper than forgiveness. You always knew how to make a point without raising your voice. That's the trick, I said. People stop listening when you shout. Inside, the watch ticked softly on the table, the steady pulse of time that had outlived anger. Somewhere out there, Langford was already rewriting the story, shaping his version of truth. But truth doesn't bend, it waits. And I was done waiting quietly. The Denver Convention Center glittered like a crystal fortress that evening. Banners hung from the ceiling, red, white, and gold, all stamped with the company's name, Langford Industries, beneath the grand slogan, Celebrating Integrity. Cameras flashed, and a brass band rehearsed patriotic songs near the stage. Somewhere in the crowd, the truth waited for its turn. Evan adjusted his tie for the third time. He looked sharp but nervous. "They're calling it a Veterans Appreciation event," he said, handing me an invitation. "Langford wants to honor you publicly. It's supposed to clear up everything." "Honor and strategy are rarely the same thing," I said. He frowned. "Dad, please, this isn't another fight. It's a chance to make peace." "Peace doesn't need an audience," I replied. But his face carried the same pleading look his mother once used when she wanted me to attend family gatherings. So I nodded. "I'll be there." Hours later, as the hall filled with polished suits and polished lies, I stepped inside. The air smelled of perfume money and ambition. Langford was on stage speaking into a microphone, his voice smooth and trained. "Tonight we honor our veterans men like General Thomas Reed, who embody courage, discipline, and sacrifice." The applause rolled through the crowd like artificial thunder. Evan clapped, his expression uncertain but hopeful. I stayed at the back watching Langford's mouth move, the words melting together into the familiar rhythm of manipulation. When his speech shifted toward corporate partnership, I knew the play. At Langford Industries, we believe in integrity, just as heroes like General Reed once fought for it. That's why we're launching the Valor Initiative, a program combining military honor with modern leadership. He paused, his smile perfectly measured. "And tonight, we're joined by the man who inspired it all. Please welcome General Thomas Reed." The spotlight turned, blinding me for a second. I felt hundreds of eyes on me, some curious, some skeptical, others hungry for a photo. Evan gestured toward the stage, mouthing, "Go on." I walked forward slowly. My steps echoed on the marble floor. The applause grew louder until it didn't sound like respect at all, just noise pretending to be gratitude. Langford met me halfway, shaking my hand firmly for the cameras. "General," he said, voice low enough for only me to hear, "let's give them a good show." I smiled faintly. "You always did like theater." We turned to face the crowd together. Flashbulbs burst. The applause softened. Langford stepped aside, handing me the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice steady, "thank you for your kindness. But I didn't come here to be remembered. I came because truth deserves a chair in every room that uses the word honor." A hush swept through the hall. Evan shifted nervously in his seat. Langford's jaw stiffened. "I served with men who didn't come home," I continued. "Their names aren't printed on invitations. They're written on the inside of the hearts of those who survived them. They don't need applause. They need honesty." Someone in the back coughed. Cameras flashed again, slower now, cautious. Langford stepped forward, his polished smile returning. "Beautiful words, General," he said. "It's fitting that we honor such noble service. And we're proud to have been part of that history. Our company, then known as Grey Tech, supplied the equipment that made the Grey Eagle mission possible." The mention of that name, Grey Tech, struck like a rifle crack. The room shifted, a murmur passing through the audience. Harris, sitting near the front, straightened in his chair. Langford pressed on, unaware that he'd just pulled the trigger on his own reputation. "Tonight we celebrate not just the soldiers who fought, but the collaboration between innovation and courage that saved lives." I turned toward him, the calm in my chest steady as stone. "Innovation," I said softly, "that cost 27 lives." The air froze. Every face turned toward me. Langford blinked. "Excuse me, the equipment your company supplied failed," I said. "We lost contact. Men died in silence, and when the investigation came, you buried the report." The microphone picked up every syllable. Harris stood up. "He's telling the truth." he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. I was there when the command log disappeared, when Thomas refused to sign the false report. Langford laughed, brittle and hollow. Colonel, surely you don't expect anyone to believe? But his voice broke off when Harris held up an old file folder. This is your signature, Langford. Your initials on the revised document dated 2 days after the mission. The one that erased the dead. The murmurs turned into a storm. Reporters whispered furiously, phones lifted to record. Langford's face went pale. I looked at him quietly. You built your empire on silence. You thought silence was your shield. But you forgot, silence remembers everything. Evan rose from his seat. His voice was soft but clear. Dad, I turned to him and gave a small nod. It's time, son. Langford backed away from the podium, his composure slipping. This is slander, he said, old men twisting stories for relevance. Harris's cane struck the floor like a gavel. Truth doesn't age, he said. But lies rot fast. The crowd erupted with questions. Cameras flashed non-stop now. Langford tried to retreat toward the side exit, but the reporters cornered him. I stepped back from the microphone. The spotlight followed me for a moment, then drifted away as Harris joined me. You could have done this years ago, he whispered. I wasn't ready, I said. Neither was the world. We started to leave, but the hall suddenly went quiet again. One man, an old veteran near the front, stood up and saluted. Then another, and another. Soon the entire front row rose, hands to brows, faces solemn and proud. Even some civilians stood awkwardly mimicking the gesture they didn't fully understand. The sound of their silence filled the room. I turned back toward them. Don't salute me, I said gently. Salute the men who didn't come home. Harris's voice broke the stillness. They are. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was slow, deliberate, and raw. Not for spectacle, but for truth finally allowed to breathe. Evan walked toward me, eyes shining. You didn't raise your voice once, he said. I smiled. Didn't need to. Langford's voice came faintly from the back, desperate shouting to reporters, denying everything, claiming misunderstanding. No one was listening anymore. As I left the hall, the heavy doors closing behind me, I could still hear the rhythmic clapping fading into the distance, measured respectful, like a heartbeat. Outside, the cold air met my face, sharp but clean. The night sky stretched wide over Denver's stars, burning through the haze. Harris stepped out beside me, his coat flapping in the wind. You finally got your justice, he said. No, I answered. They did. He nodded. Still, that was one hell of a shot. Sometimes I said the cleanest shots don't make noise. We stood there a while, watching the lights inside flicker like a dying fire. Then he turned to leave. I looked back one last time through the glass doors. Inside, Evan was still standing near the stage, surrounded by quiet chaos, reporters shouting, lights, flashing papers, waving. But he wasn't watching them. His gaze followed me, calm, certain. For the first time, I saw understanding in his eyes, not pride, not guilt, but something steadier. Respect. I raised my hand slightly, a silent salute. He returned it. And just like that, the doors shut between us. The applause died. The city hummed softly around me. Justice had finally spoken, and it hadn't needed a single shout. The next morning, the newspapers were merciless. Langford's face splashed across every front page, his integrity initiative now labeled the Valor Scandal. Headlines spoke of hidden reports, falsified contracts, and a cover-up that had finally come to light. The photo beneath those headlines caught my attention. Not Langford's pale expression, but the image beside it. Evan standing off to the side, eyes wide, half in shadow. I sat at my kitchen table, coffee cooling the paper spread like a battlefield after the smoke had cleared. Harris had called earlier, voice low with something between triumph and exhaustion. "It's done," he'd said. "The inquiry's been reopened. They'll dig up what's left of the truth." "Be careful what you dig up," I told him. "Some truths come with shrapnel." He chuckled softly. "You've lived with it long enough. Time for the world to carry its share." Now alone in the quiet, I wasn't sure whether victory had ever felt so heavy. The phone buzzed once. Evan's name glowed on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "Dad," he said, voice unsteady. "They're all calling. Reporters, colleagues, even Langford's board. They want statements." "And what do you want?" I asked. He hesitated. "I want to understand why you waited this long. You could have cleared your name years ago." "It wasn't about clearing mine," I said. "It was about letting the right moment speak. Truth without timing is noise. People are calling you a hero again," he said. "Is that what you wanted?" I looked out the window, the morning light cutting across the yard. "No, I just wanted you to see who I really was. Not the loser at the table, not the man you thought had nothing left." Silence. Then he said quietly, "I see you now." The words landed harder than I expected. I closed my eyes, feeling years of distance shrink to something small and fragile. "Then it was worth it," I said. Later that day, I drove out toward the base. The old training grounds had been turned into a memorial park, the kind of place where flags stayed clean and flowers never wilted. Harris was waiting by the stone wall, leaning on his cane, the cold wind pushing at his coat. "You should have seen Langford this morning," he said. "Board forced him out before breakfast. They're launching a full audit, maybe even charges." "He'll survive," I said. "Men like him always find another crowd to clap for them." Maybe, Harris replied, but not the same way. "You didn't just ruin his company. You reminded people that honor still has a price tag, and not everyone's willing to sell it." We walked in silence for a while. The memorial stretched ahead, names etched into granite like quiet prayers. Some I recognized. Others were ghosts I'd stopped trying to remember individually because the pain demanded too much. Harris stopped near the center where a bronze plaque caught the light. "They're holding a ceremony here next week," he said. "A real one. No sponsors, no cameras, just families." "I'll come," I said. He nodded. "Evan should too. I don't know if he's ready." "Then make him ready," Harris said, eyes narrowing. "You gave him the truth. Now teach him what to do with it." That night I sat by the fireplace, the flames tracing memories on the walls. The house smelled of smoke and old wood, and for the first time in years, it felt alive. A small photo stood on the mantel, Evan at age 8 holding a paper medal he'd made for me after a school project. The crayon letters read, "World's Best Dad, General Hero." I remembered smiling at the time and thinking he'd outgrow that kind of hero worship. He had. The doorbell broke my thoughts. When I opened it, Evan stood there, rein on his shoulders, eyes tired. "Come in," I said. He stepped inside, hesitating at the threshold like a boy unsure whether he was welcome. "You were right," he said quietly. "Langford's finished. They're calling it corporate treason in the press." Harris's statement sealed it. I gestured toward the fire. "And you, I resigned," he said. "I couldn't stay after what happened. They treated me like an accomplice, or worse, a fool." "You're neither," I said. "But sometimes walking away is the only way to keep your footing." He sank into the chair opposite me. For a while, the only sound was the rain ticking against the window. Then he spoke again. "When I called you a loser, I thought I was protecting myself from embarrassment from what I didn't understand. You stood there and said nothing. How could you stay so calm?" "Because shouting back would have made you smaller," I said. "And I'd already spent a lifetime trying to make sure you never felt small." He looked at the fire, his throat working. I don't deserve your patience. Patience isn't something you earn, I said. It's what you give when love has outlasted anger. We sat in silence again, the kind that mends rather than divides. Then he asked, what happens now? Now, I said, you decide what kind of man you want to be when no one's watching. That's where integrity begins. Not on a stage, not at a press conference. He nodded slowly. Maybe I'll start by standing beside you at that memorial. I smiled. That's a good place to begin. When he left, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. I stepped outside and looked up at the stars hiding behind clouds. Somewhere out there, the past was finally resting. 2 days later, the phone rang again, an unfamiliar number. When I answered, a reporter's voice filled the line. General Reed, we'd like a comment about Langford's resignation. The public deserves to hear your side. I've said all I needed to say, I replied. But sir, you're being hailed as the man who brought down a corrupt empire. People want to know how it feels. It feels like work's still unfinished, I said. Find the families who lost someone on Grey Eagle. Ask them how it feels. Before he could respond, I hung up. The next morning, I went to the cemetery early. Dew glistened on the grass, and a thin mist hung low over the stones. Harris was already there, adjusting a wreath. Evan arrived a few minutes later, his hands in his pockets, shoulders straight. He looked at the rows of names and whispered, You knew all of them, enough to remember the sound of their laughter, I said. He crouched, touching one of the names. They trusted you. They trusted the mission, I corrected. And I trusted the world to learn from their loss. It took longer than I hoped. When the sun broke through the fog, Harris cleared his throat. They're waiting for you to say something, Tom. I looked up. A small crowd had gathered, families, veterans, quiet strangers holding flowers. I stepped forward and let the words come without rehearsal. Honor doesn't belong to medals or headlines, I said. It belongs to the choices we make when no one is clapping. These men and women chose courage, not applause. They gave everything. The least we can give is truth. The wind moved through the flags, gentle as a sigh. Evan stood beside me, his head bowed. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed, he turned to me. You were right, he said. Peace doesn't need an audience. No, I said, smiling. But it appreciates company. We walked to the car together, quiet, steady. The sound of gravel underfoot felt like a heartbeat that finally knew its rhythm. That night I wrote a letter I didn't plan to send. To the families. To Helen. To the men I'd lost. The truth came late, I wrote, but it came walking, not running. It didn't shout. It stood tall, waited for its moment, and when it finally spoke, the noise stopped. Maybe that's what justice sounds like when it's real. I folded the letter and slipped it into the drawer beside the old medals. The fire had gone out, but the house was warm. Somewhere outside, the wind carried the faint echo of applause, distant, slow, honest. I didn't need to hear it to know what it meant. The war at last was over. The house felt quieter after Evan left that night. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty, but earned. I sat by the window with a cup of coffee gone cold and watched the lights of the small town flicker through the fog. Somewhere out there, the world had already begun turning my story into its own version, press releases, headlines, speculation. But here silence did its job. It kept the truth clean. The next morning, a car rolled up the driveway. A black sedan polished enough to reflect the pine trees on either side. A man stepped out wearing a dark suit, government-issue crisp lines, practiced posture. He walked up the path and stopped short of the porch. General Reed, he asked. Retired, I said, opening the screen door. You're from Washington. He nodded. Deputy Director Collins, Department of Defense Liaison. May I come in? He didn't wait for an answer. Bureaucrats rarely do. I gestured toward the kitchen table, the same one where I'd once taught Evan to tie a proper knot. Collins set down a leather folder, its seal embossed in gold. First, sir, on behalf of the department, thank you for your service and for the integrity you've shown recently. Your disclosure has prompted a full review of the Gray Tech contracts. That's good, I said. Integrity only matters if someone audits it once in a while. He smiled tightly, not sure if it was a joke. There's more. We're establishing a commission to investigate Langford Industries' involvement in the procurement fraud. Given your history with the mission, we'd like you to serve as senior advisor. I leaned back. So you want the old soldier to clean up the new mess? You're the only one who knows both sides, he said. And people trust you again. That matters. I studied him. Behind the polite words there was urgency, fear. Maybe the kind that comes when the system realizes it can't hide behind medals anymore. I'll consider it, I said finally. Collins nodded, stood, and handed me a card. We'd appreciate your answer soon. There's pressure from above. And General, he paused, lowering his voice. Some of the files you brought forward were classified. There are questions about how you still had them. I met his gaze. When you lose 27 men because of a lie, you keep proof. Not for revenge, for remembrance. He didn't reply, just tucked the folder under his arm and left the way he came, efficient, careful, afraid of saying too much. That night, Harris called again. They'll want you to sit in those hearings, he said. Give testimony. You ready for that kind of storm I've stood in? Worse weather, I said. He chuckled. You always did have a way of making calm sound dangerous. 2 days later, the hearings began in Washington. The room smelled of dust paper and ambition. Rows of microphones waited like sentinels. Langford sat at one end of the table, pale and rigid, flanked by lawyers who whispered like snakes. Cameras pointed at his face, waiting for cracks. When they called my name, the room shifted. I walked to the witness seat, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore the oath I'd sworn a lifetime ago. My voice didn't shake. The questions started politely. Dates, procedures, chain of command. Then they turned sharp. General Reed, one senator, said, "Are you claiming Langford Industries knowingly falsified safety reports on equipment used during Operation Gray Eagle?" "I'm not claiming it," I said. "I'm confirming it." Langford's lawyer stood. "Objection, speculation." "Overruled," the chair said. I went on. Those reports were altered under pressure from corporate executives who prioritized contracts over lives. I objected at the time and was told to focus on morale, not paperwork. Morale doesn't keep men alive. Proper wiring does. The senator leaned forward. "Do you have proof of this alteration?" "I do. And I've provided it." Langford shifted in his seat, whispering to his counsel. His face was a study in panic, wrapped in civility. Then came the question that mattered. "General Reed, why wait 20 years to come forward?" And I looked straight at the committee. "Because I believed silence would protect the living. I was wrong. Silence only protects the comfortable." The room fell still. A few heads bowed, others nodded. Harris, sitting in the audience behind me, tapped his cane once against the floor, our old signal for well said. When the hearing adjourned, reporters crowded the hallway. Microphones flashed like lightning. I didn't stop. I'd spent enough years being misquoted by people who'd never been under fire. Outside, the air was thick with summer heat and the smell of rain on pavement. Evan was waiting by the car, watching from a distance. He looked older somehow, though it had only been weeks. "You handled it well," he said as I reached him. "Truth handles itself," I said. "You just have to get out of its way." He smiled faintly. They're calling you a national hero again. Let them call what they want, I said. Names don't change the facts. We drove back in silence. Halfway through the highway, he asked, Will, you take the advisor job? I haven't decided. Why not? Because I've spent too many years cleaning up after men who thought leadership meant paperwork. If I go back in, I want it to mean something. He nodded slowly. Then make it mean something. That night I couldn't sleep. The rain drummed against the roof in steady rhythm, and the house creaked like an old ship. I got up, poured a drink, and opened the folder Collins had left behind. Inside were drafts of the new ethics reform proposal, a blueprint for transparency, a plan to monitor defense contracts, a promise that this kind of failure wouldn't happen again. It looked good on paper. Too good. I made notes in the margins. Add accountability chain. Independent audit required. Civilian oversight mandatory. By dawn, the pages were covered in my handwriting. I sealed them in an envelope and set it on the table for delivery. The sun crawled through the curtains, painting the room in gold. For the first time in years, I felt the kind of tired that came from purpose, not regret. At noon, Collins called. We reviewed your notes. The secretary agrees. You'll chair the commission. I didn't agree yet, I said. You just did, he replied, almost smiling through the phone. I laughed softly. Then I suppose it's time to get back to work. For the next month, I lived between meetings, reports, and interviews. Journalists chased me for sound bites. Politicians used my name as if it were currency. Through it all, I stayed still. Harris called it my war face. I called it survival. Evan came by one evening with takeout and exhaustion in his eyes. I've been thinking, he said, setting down the food. Maybe it's time I do something real. Not corporate, not PR. Something that matters. I looked up. Like what Veterans Rights, he said. There's a nonprofit forming around the families of the Gray Eagle unit. They want someone to handle communication advocacy. I thought I could help. That's good work, I said. Hard work. He grinned. Guess it runs in the family. The words warmed the room more than the food ever could. Weeks later, I stood again at the memorial. The new plaque gleamed under the morning sun in honor of those who served and those who refused to forget. Below it, a small line added quietly by the committee, "Truth does not expire." Evan was there too, handing out small flags to families. Harris sat in his chair, sunglasses on, pretending not to cry. As the crowd thinned, I looked around and realized something simple but profound. I was no longer invisible. Not because of the cameras or titles, but because the people who mattered could finally see what I'd been standing for all along. When the ceremony ended, Evan came to stand beside me. You think Mom would have been proud? He asked. I smiled. She would have said it took me long enough. He laughed quietly, and together we watched the flags ripple in the soft wind. The past had stopped chasing us. The future had started listening. For once, that was enough. The autumn wind in Washington carried the smell of rain and paper, an odd combination that always reminded me of hearings and unfinished wars. The city had grown louder since the investigation began. Reporters clustering like pigeons around every marble step, waiting for quotes that could be twisted into something louder than truth. I'd learned to walk past them, steady and unreadable. Noise had its purpose, but silence held power. Inside the commission building, the halls were a maze of whispers and polished shoes. Staffers nodded as I passed their expressions, a blend of respect and fear. The title Chairman Reed had started appearing on door plaques and memos. A label I never asked for, but accepted the way soldiers accept the weather, uncomfortable, inevitable. Today was the day we released the findings of the Graytech investigation. Months of data testimonies and paper trails led to one conclusion. Langford Industries had falsified safety reports and manipulated procurement officials for nearly a decade. My name sat at the top of the report, underlined twice. Not pride. Accountability. Collins met me outside the chamber. "Everything's ready, General," he said. "Press conference in an hour. The secretary will join remotely." "I thought this was about justice," I said. "Not theater." He hesitated. "Justice needs an audience, sir. Otherwise, it fades into another file." I sighed and stepped through the door. The conference room was already filling with press cameras clicking like insects. A long table stood under harsh white light microphones waiting. Harris was there too, sitting in the back row, hat in his lap. He gave me a small nod. When I reached the podium, I scanned the faces in front of me, some curious, some skeptical, some hungry. "The Commission's report," I began, "is not a story of revenge. It's a record of responsibility. The cost of negligence isn't paid in dollars. It's paid in names carved into stone." Flashes erupted. I continued. "Langford Industries will face criminal prosecution. But this isn't about one man's greed. It's about a culture that rewards silence. The next time someone is told to look away, I hope they remember this moment." The applause was hesitant, cautious. People don't cheer for accountability until it's safe. I gathered the papers, thanked them, and stepped away. Outside, Evan was waiting near the car. He looked different, calmer, less burdened by the shadow of my past. "They'll be talking about that speech for a while," he said. "I hope they act on it instead," I replied. He grinned. Always the soldier. We drove in silence until the city gave way to open fields. The road shimmered in the distance, heat rising from asphalt that hadn't decided whether it belonged to summer or fall. Evan turned down the radio. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you," he said. I looked at him. His hands gripped the wheel tighter. "I met someone. Her name's Julia. She runs the Veterans Housing Project we've been supporting." "Good woman?" I asked. "The kind who doesn't flinch when life gets messy," he said. "She knows about everything Langford, the hearings, even my mistakes. Still wants to stick around." "That's rare," I said. "Hold on to her." He smiled, but his eyes stayed on the road. "She says you should come to the fundraiser next month." "It's not fancy. Just barbecue local crowd. They're naming one of the houses after Mom." The air caught in my throat. "Helen's name." "Yeah," he said softly, "the Helen Reed House. For single mothers starting over." I turned toward the window so he wouldn't see my face. "She'd like that," I said. She always believed home wasn't a building. It was the people inside it. We reached the memorial park again that evening. Harris was there, cane tapping in rhythm with the wind. He looked smaller than before, but his eyes were sharp. "Word travels fast," he said. "You made history today, Tom. They'll quote you in ethics manuals." "Let them," I said. "Truth deserves to be boring once in a while." He chuckled. "You know there's talk of giving you a medal. Civilian honor for exposing corruption." I shook my head. "No more medals. I've already buried too many that came with them." We stood quietly watching the flags ripple against the dying light. Harris cleared his throat. "You ever think about what comes after this? You can't stay in the fight forever." "I'm not fighting anymore," I said. "Just building fences to keep the weeds from growing back." "Then build something good," he said. "You've got time left. Use it." He left before I could answer. That night I sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey, the kind that burned just enough to remind you you're still alive. The stars were out sharp against the black. I took out the old pocket watch Helen had given me and wound it carefully. The tick was steady now, like a heartbeat that had found its rhythm again. The phone buzzed. "A message from Collins. Excellent work today. History will remember you kindly." I typed back, "I don't care if history remembers me. I care if it remembers them." Then I turned the phone face down. A week later, I received an invitation embossed with gold, the President's Gala for National Integrity, a celebration of reform, honoring those who reminded the nation of its conscience. I almost threw it away. But Evan called that night. "You should go," he said. "It's not about glory, it's about closure." Closure. The word sat heavy on my tongue. I told him I'd think about it. When the night came, I stood at the edge of the ballroom, surrounded by laughter and champagne. The chandeliers sparkled like stars that had forgotten how to be distant. Politicians, journalists, and generals moved like clockwork, each one rehearsing sincerity. A young woman approached with a camera. "General Reed, may I have a photo?" I nodded, forcing a polite smile. Her flash went off, freezing my face. In an image I didn't recognize, a man both remembered and forgotten. Then I saw Langford across the room. He was thinner, grayer, stripped of his empire. He stood alone near the corner, holding a glass he hadn't touched. When our eyes met, he hesitated, then walked over. "Thomas," he said quietly, "may I speak with you?" "Free country," I said. He swallowed hard. "I came to apologize. Not for losing, not for what the papers say, for forgetting that men like you existed." I studied him. The arrogance was gone. Only exhaustion remained. "You didn't forget," I said. "You ignored it." He nodded slowly. "Maybe that's worse." "It is," I said. He extended his hand. I looked at it for a long moment before shaking it. "You can't buy back honor," I told him. "But you can stop selling it." He nodded again, eyes glassy, and walked away. Evan appeared beside me. "That was generous," he said. "Justice without mercy is just another kind of arrogance," I said. He smiled faintly. "You really are impossible to argue with." We left before the speeches began. Outside, the night air smelled like rain again. I looked up at the Capitol dome glowing in the distance and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Quiet satisfaction, the kind that doesn't need applause. Evan clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You did good, Dad." I exhaled, watching my breath fade into the dark. No sun. We did. The sound of our footsteps echoed down the marble steps as the city lights shimmered below. The war was long over, but the lessons were still marching on. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't mind the sound of the drums. Snow began to fall over Arlington the morning the dedication ceremony was held. The sky was a hard, pale gray, the kind that made the air feel sharp and clean. I arrived early, long before the crowd, and walked along the rows of white stones, dusted with frost. Each one held a story, a voice, a promise. Some I still remembered by name. Others I recognized by silence. The new memorial stood at the far end of the hill, a bronze sculpture of two soldiers lifting a wounded comrade, their faces turned toward an unseen horizon. A simple plaque below read, "For those who carried more than their share." It wasn't grand, but it was honest. That mattered. I heard footsteps behind me. Evan was approaching, his coat collar turned up against the cold. He looked older too, but in a way that meant stronger. "They did a good job," he said quietly. "They did," I agreed. No speeches, just the work itself. He smiled faintly. "Julia said you'd like that." "How is she?" "Good. Busy. She's helping the first families move into the Helen Reed house this week." I looked out over the cemetery, the snow softening the lines between stone and ground. "Your mother would have liked her," I said. Evan nodded. "She says the same about you." We stood there side by side as people began to gather, a few reporters, veterans, families with folded flags in their hands. Harris arrived with the help of a younger officer, his cane digging into the snow with each step. "Damn weather," he grumbled, smiling anyway. "Figures the army picks the coldest day to teach humility. You'd complain if it were warm," I said. He chuckled. "Maybe, but at least then my knees wouldn't sound like radio static." The ceremony began without fanfare. A choir of cadets sang low, steady notes that drifted like smoke through the air. No one clapped. No one needed to. After the final verse, the director of Veterans Affairs stepped forward and called my name. Cameras turned. I felt every lens like a weight. I shook my head slightly. "No speech," I whispered. He hesitated, then nodded and stepped aside. Instead, I walked to the base of the memorial and placed a single dog tag beneath the plaque. It belonged to a man named Carter, one of the ones we lost in the mountains that year. I'd kept it all this time not out of guilt, but because it had reminded me what duty was supposed to mean. Harris saluted, slowly, painfully. The sound of his breath caught between the notes of the wind. Others followed one by one until the hill was filled with raised hands and bowed heads. When it was over, I found Evan again near the line of trees. His eyes were wet, but he didn't wipe them. "That was different," he said. "Peaceful. That's what truth does when you let it breathe," I said. He nodded, then looked at me with a mix of hesitation and resolve. "There's something I want to tell you. Julia and I were expecting." The words hit softly, but carried more weight than any metal. "You're going to be a father." "Yeah," he said, smiling in disbelief. "I've been meaning to tell you, but after everything that happened, it never felt like the right time." "There's never a right time," I said. "Just the moment you choose to stop waiting." He exhaled, looking out over the snow-covered stones. "I want my child to grow up knowing who you really are, not just the man from the headlines, the man who taught me that dignity isn't loud." "You'll do better," I said. "That's how legacy's supposed to work." We left the cemetery as the sky began to clear. The snow had stopped, leaving the air bright and still. That evening, Harris joined me for dinner at my place. The fire crackled in the hearth, the room thick with the smell of pine and old bourbon. He raised his glass. "To the ghosts who finally got their due. To the living who carried them," I said. He grinned. "You ever gonna write any of this down? The whole story, the hearings, the scandal, the silence? People would read it." I shook my head. "It's already written, just not in ink. Still, it might help the next poor fool who thinks silence is noble." I smiled. "Maybe I'll leave him this pocket watch instead." He looked at it ticking softly on the table. "Still running as steady as ever," I said. "Helen picked a good one." He leaned back in his chair. "You think she'd be proud of how it ended?" "No," I said. "She'd be proud that it ended." When he left, the house grew quiet again. I cleaned the glasses, stoked the fire, and sat for a long time, watching the flames reflect in the watch's glass face. The ticking matched my heartbeat, even and unhurried. Later, I walked outside. The stars were sharp against the cold, the kind of night sky that made the world feel both small and infinite. Down the road, I could see the faint lights of the Helen Reed house through the trees. Families moving in laughter, muffled by distance and snow. Evan had told me they'd built a small library inside, stocked with donated books, one shelf labeled Stories of Strength. Somewhere in that pile, he'd slipped in my old field journal. I hadn't opened it in years. I'd told him to burn it once, but he hadn't. Maybe he was right. Maybe some truths deserved to live past the men who carried them. The next morning, I woke early and packed a small bag. Collins had asked me to travel to Colorado for a new initiative, training young officers in ethics and accountability. "You're living proof," he'd said. I didn't argue. The world still needed reminders. Before I left, I placed the pocket watch on the kitchen counter beside a note for Evan. For your son when he's old enough to understand that time isn't to be filled, but honored. The car waited at the edge of the drive. I looked back once before climbing in the house, quiet, the yard bare, except for 2 sets of footprints that led nowhere in particular. As we pulled away, the first light of dawn stretched across the hills, soft and forgiving. The radio played something old and calm, a song I couldn't name but recognized all the same. By the time we reached the highway, the watch had already begun a new rhythm in another home, and the world for once felt balanced. Some wars end with silence. Others end with understanding. Mine ended with both. And for the first time in decades, I knew exactly what peace sounded like. It was the steady tick of a promise kept. Colorado's air was thin and clean, the kind that burned your lungs before you realized it was just honesty in another form. The training center sat high in the mountains, a cluster of steel and glass surrounded by pines that whispered like old soldiers swapping secrets. I'd come here to teach a new generation of officers about ethics, command, and the quiet weight of decision-making. What they didn't know was that I was still learning those lessons myself. The first morning I stood before a classroom of 20 recruits, all young enough to believe the world still owed them something. Their uniforms were crisp, their eyes bright, their notebooks already open. On the board behind me, someone had written in large letters, "Leadership through accountability." I erased it before I spoke. "Accountability isn't a slogan," I said. "It's what you choose when no one's looking. It's the difference between command and control. One earns trust. The other demands obedience. Guess which one lasts longer?" A few of them smiled nervously. Others wrote it down as if the words might one day save them. I walked between the rows, the smell of ink and metal hanging in the air. A cadet raised her hand. "Sir, did you ever make a decision you regretted?" I looked at her, remembering the faces of the men lost in the mountains, the orders that echoed long after they'd been carried out. "Every good commander regrets something," I said. "The trick is not to let the regret make your next decision for you." That earned a quiet nod from the back row. They were listening now, not because of authority, but because of truth. After class, one of the instructors, a man named Harris, no relation to my old friend, walked beside me through the courtyard. "They hang on your every word," he said. "You give them hope." "Hope's a dangerous thing to give," I said. "It makes people think you have answers." He smiled. Maybe that's what they need, someone who isn't afraid to admit he doesn't. I stayed on the base for 6 weeks. Each day followed the same rhythm: lectures in the morning, field exercises in the afternoon, reflections at night. But somewhere between the repetition, something shifted. The students stopped treating me like a hero from the papers and started treating me like a man who'd simply lived long enough to make peace with his mistakes. That was better. One afternoon, after a long hike through the snow, I found a letter waiting on my desk. The handwriting was familiar. Evan. I opened it carefully. "Dad. The house is full now. The families are settling in, and the library looks beautiful. Julia's belly is getting bigger by the day. She says your grandson kicks whenever she hears your voice on TV. Maybe he already knows you're the stubborn one in the family. I've been thinking about everything we went through, and I realized something. You didn't just fight corruption. You taught me what silence can cost. I'm trying to do the same here in smaller ways. Every story we tell at the foundation starts with your lesson. Truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to last. Come home soon. There's someone I want you to meet. Love, Evan." I read it twice. The first time as a father. The second time as a man who had spent too long learning what love looked like after loss. The following day, I gathered the recruits in the assembly hall for their final lecture. "I've been asked to speak about leadership," I began, "but I'd rather talk about memory. The world will try to make you forget the people who paid for your comfort. Don't let it. History doesn't live in books. It lives in your choices. I paused, letting the silence breathe. Every war leaves ghosts. The question is whether you'll carry them as burdens or as lessons. If you carry them right, they stop haunting you and start guiding you. When I finished, no one clapped. They didn't need to. Their faces said enough. That night I sat outside the barracks under a sky so wide it could swallow a man whole. The mountains loomed dark against the horizon, and the air buzzed with the quiet hum of wind turbines turning slowly in the distance. I took out my wife's watch and wound it once, feeling the click of the gears settle under my thumb. Time, it seemed, had forgiven me for wasting it. Before dawn, I packed my things. As I left, the young cadet who'd asked me about regret stopped me at the gate. "Sir," she said, "what do we do when the people above us don't want to hear the truth?" I smiled. "You say it anyway. Then you build a life that proves it." The drive back to Santa Fe took most of the day. The sun followed me the whole way down the mountain, turning snow to gold and shadows to long, honest lines. When I reached town, the streets were filled with the smell of bread and cedar smoke. The Helen Reed house stood at the end of the road, bright and alive. Evan was waiting by the gate. Julia stood beside him, round with life, her hands resting on her belly. When she saw me, she smiled. "He's been kicking all morning," she said. "Guess he knew you were close." I laughed softly. "Smart boy." Evan hugged me, a real one this time, the kind that holds instead of apologizes. "You look tired," he said. "I've been teaching honesty to 20-year-olds, I said. "That's harder than any war." He grinned. "Come inside. We made dinner." The house was warm, the walls painted a soft yellow that reminded me of Helen's favorite room in the old place. Laughter drifted from the kitchen, where volunteers set plates and poured coffee. Children ran between tables, their shoes squeaking on the tile. For a moment I stood in the doorway, watching it all. The noise, the motion, the proof that something good had survived. During dinner, one of the mothers stood and raised her glass. "To the man who gave us more than shelter," she said. "To the man who reminded us that dignity is a kind of roof, too." Everyone clapped. I nodded, embarrassed, and looked down at my plate. Evan leaned over and whispered, "You're going to have to get used to that." "Never," I said. After the meal, Julia brought out a small box. "We thought you might like this," she said. Inside was a new pocket watch, silver and engraved. "For the general who taught us time can heal." I traced the letters with my finger. "Thank you," I said quietly. "But the old one still works?" Evan smiled. "Then keep this one for when he's old enough to ask what you taught us." He nodded toward Julia's belly, and I understood. The next generation would know the story, not the headlines, not the scandal, but the lesson. Later, when the house emptied and the lamps dimmed, I stepped outside. The night air smelled of rain and lavender. The stars were clearer here than they'd ever been over Washington. Evan joined me on the porch. "You think he'll ever understand what you went through?" "Maybe," I said. "But I hope he never has to." He leaned against the railing. "You always know what to say." "No," I said. "I just know what not to waste words on." The watch ticked softly in my hand. Somewhere behind us, laughter drifted from a window, a child's laugh, bright and new. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a man, haunted by what he'd lost. I felt like a man preparing to leave something behind that was finally worth keeping. The world outside kept moving, slow, steady, beautiful. I let it. The morning light slid gently through the curtains, painting gold across the small house in Santa Fe. The air smelled of coffee and lavender, and the only sound was the steady tick of the pocket watch resting on the table beside me. For the first time in years, there were no calls to return, no hearings to attend, no ghosts waiting to be acknowledged. The war I had carried inside me had gone quiet. Evan stepped out onto the porch with his son in his arms. The boy's laughter broke through the stillness like sunlight cutting through fog. Julia followed, smiling the way only a mother can, her hair caught by the morning breeze. "Good morning," General Evan teased. "Retired," I said, "and out of uniform for good." He laughed and handed me the baby. The child's fingers closed around my thumb, impossibly small and strong. His eyes were bright and curious, as if the world already made sense to him. "We've decided on a name," Julia said. "Henry Thomas Reed." The sound of it landed softly in the air. "Henry," I repeated. "He sounds like someone who'll grow into his name." Evan smiled. "He'll grow into yours too." "No," I said. "He should only grow into his own. Let him write his own story. Just make sure he knows what kind of ink to use." The baby gurgled, waving his hand as if he'd already agreed. Julia laughed. For a moment I felt the world balance itself perfectly between past and future regret and forgiveness. Later that morning, we drove to the Helen Reed Foundation. The building was modest, set at the edge of town, sunlight spilling across its clean glass windows. The parking lot was full. Families, veterans, and students gathered around the new wing being unveiled. A small brass plaque gleamed under the entry arch. "For those who served quietly and lived truth loudly." When I stepped out, people turned. Some nodded, some saluted, and some simply smiled. A few of my former cadets from Colorado stood among them. One of them, a young woman named Vega, approached me with a firm handshake. "You once told us patience is how truth breathes," she said. "We've kept that on the wall of the classroom." I smiled. "Then keep the windows open too. Truth needs air." She laughed, and for a brief second I saw the same spark I'd once seen in Helen's eyes, stubborn hope disguised as calm. Inside, volunteers moved boxes of supplies into classrooms and study rooms. The sound of children's laughter echoed down the hall. Julia was talking to the foundation director about new housing grants. Evan stood near the entrance, holding Henry and watching everything unfold. His expression carried the kind of quiet pride that never asks to be seen. I walked to the main wall where a mural was being finished. It showed a field of wild lavender stretching beneath a wide sky. At the edge, an artist was adding a figure, an old soldier sitting on a bench, looking out at the horizon. The detail was simple but precise. I didn't need to ask who he was. I left the building quietly and drove out toward the Veterans Cemetery. The mountains looked blue and distant under the afternoon light. Harris's grave was easy to find. His old cane leaned against the headstone just as his son had left it. "Figured you'd still be talking sense somewhere," I said, lowering myself onto the grass beside him. "You were right about everything. The fight's over." The noise stopped, but it was worth every bruise. The wind answered for him, brushing through the tall grass. I reached into my coat and pulled out a folded paper, a letter I'd written weeks earlier titled, "Lessons for the Next One." I read it aloud. "Tell the truth, even when it sounds like breaking glass. Love your family harder than your pride. And when peace comes, don't mistake it for weakness." I folded it again and placed it under the cane. "That's all I've got left, old friend. The rest belongs to time." Evening rolled across the hills as I drove home. The horizon glowed in deep shades of orange and violet when I walked through the front door. The smell of dinner wrapped around me, roast chicken, rosemary laughter. Julia was setting the table. Evan was rocking the baby near the window, the last of the light shining through the glass and touching them both. I went to my study, opened the drawer, and took out 2 watches, the one Helen had given me long ago, and the silver one they'd engraved for me at the foundation. I wound them both carefully, listening to their separate ticks fall into rhythm. Then I opened my journal, its pages worn and waiting, and wrote a final line. "Peace isn't what follows justice. Peace is what remains when justice no longer needs your name. When I closed the book, Evan appeared in the doorway. "Dinner's ready," he said. I handed him the old watch. "When the time comes, give it to Henry. But don't tell him it belonged to a soldier. Tell him it belonged to a man who finally learned to listen." He nodded, eyes wet. "He'll know." We stepped outside together. The night had fallen soft and clear. Julia brought the baby out wrapped in a blanket, his small head resting against her shoulder. The three of us sat at the table under the porch lights, the air filled with the sound of crickets and the smell of lavender. For a long while, no one spoke. We didn't need to. I looked up at the stars, the same ones that had once watched over battlefields, now shining over a dinner table that didn't need defending. The ticking of the watch in Evan's pocket blended with the rhythm of the night. Time had kept its promise. I raised my glass. "To truth that endured," I said quietly, "and to peace that learned our names." Evan smiled. "To you, Dad." "To all of us," I said, "because no one wins a war alone." The desert wind moved through the lavender, carrying the faint scent of flowers and dust. The lights flickered gently and the house behind us glowed with warmth. Maybe peace didn't arrive with applause or banners. Maybe it simply waited for you to stop running. As the night deepened, I thought of every face that had brought me here: Helen Harris, the soldiers, even Langford. Each one had shaped the path that ended at this quiet table. The baby stirred, opening his eyes for a moment, and I felt the years settle softly around me, like an old coat I didn't mind wearing anymore. "Sleep, little one," I whispered. "The world's quieter than it used to be." The stars blinked once in answer. The night exhaled. If you're still listening wherever you are, remember this: every battle, no matter how loud, ends with a choice. Choose truth. Choose peace. Choose to keep going. And if this story found you tonight, leave a word below. Tell me where you're watching from and who you're fighting for. Because some stories don't end when the telling stops. They live on in the hearts that hear them. Like, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories that remind us that time may age the body, but truth never grows old.